Welcome to the presentation of the ÖFSE Flagship Report 2021, dedicated to the topic of COVID-19 and its implication on the Global South. My name is Margarita Langthaler. I am a researcher here at the Austrian Foundation for Development Research, and it is my pleasure to facilitate today's discussion. And I will now hand the floor over to ÖFSE Director Werner Ratzer.
Well, thank you, Margarita. Dear colleagues, dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the presentation of this year's annual flagship report Österreichische Entwicklungspolitik 2021. As always, the report contains 3 sections. In the first part, we present a series of analytical contributions on a pertinent topic. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this year's topic concerns the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the countries of the Global South. The second part of the publication presents our analysis of Austrian financial flows to developing countries. The publication concludes with a summary overview of important events in Austrian development policy in 2021 and also a part of the year 2020. This year's special topic concerns the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the countries of the Global South. The pandemic has hit developing countries particularly hard, both in economic terms and also in social terms. Massive income losses, impoverishment and rising inequality overburdened health systems, and a regression in education participation are only the first immediately perceptible impacts. But as we are currently witnessing with the rapid proliferation of the new coronavirus variant Omicron, the pandemic is far from over. The large-scale failure to effectively deal with the crisis at the international level is deeply concerning. The international community, and in particular the European Union, must urgently step up their efforts to find effective solutions at the global level. Also, the Austrian government must do more and should in particular support efforts to scale up production of vaccines in the Global South, including through supporting the suspension of patent rights on medical treatments at the WTO. Unless the international community finds comprehensive and proactive policy responses, the COVID-19 crisis will not only lead to another lost decades for many countries in the Global South, but will have severe repercussions on economic and social welfare also in Austria and other high-income countries. It is thus with great pleasure that in our report, we have brought together a collection of analyses and assessments from distinguished international experts. Let me take the opportunity and express my gratitude to all contributors for their cooperation under difficult circumstances. I also thank Margarita Langthaler for the careful coordination of the thematic section, Michael Obrovsky for the authoritative financial analysis in section 2, and Nicolas Meiler-Pokorny for compiling the summary overview in section 3. So let me end by wishing you a very stimulating discussion and active interchange. And I hand over back to our moderator, Margarita. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Werner, for this introduction. So we will be discussing our flagship report tonight. Hannes, could you just show it? It is available from our website at the link that you can see on the slide. And you can also order a print copy at ÖFSE. It's fresh from the press. We received it 2 days ago from printing. Okay, let us now have a look at today's program. We just heard a welcome and introduction by ÖFSE Director Werner Ratzer. And our first program point will be Austrian financial flows and their implications for Austrian development policy by Michael Obrovsky from ÖFSE. We will then have a short session of question and answers and a short coffee break just to refresh ourselves. And we will then at 17:40 start again with the panel discussion on COVID-19 and the Global South. And our panelists tonight will be Richard Kozul-Wright from UNCTAD, Jan Grumiller from ÖFSE, and Pauline Veron from ECDPM. This will be followed by a comment from the perspective of development policy, and I'm very happy that Wolfgang Lapuh from the Federal Ministry for European and International Affairs will join us for this comment. And then we will have time for a question and answer session. until about 19 hours. So this is our today program. We will start with an analysis of the Austrian financial flows to the Global South. Let me introduce my colleague, Michael Obrovsky, to you. Michael Obrovsky is ÖFSE's Deputy Director and a senior researcher. His work focuses on the fields of Austrian and international development policy, development cooperation, and development financing. He studied communication sciences, philosophy, and sciences of art at the University of Vienna. Michael Obrovsky is also a lecturer at Vienna University and member of various committees of Austrian and international development institutions. Michael Obrovsky will do his presentation in German language, but questions can be asked in German or in English. Michael, the floor is yours. Bitte schön.
Danke vielmals. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I switched to German because our target group who is interested in data is mostly German, so I'm going to present the data in German. I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation I would like to present. Could you see the PowerPoint presentation? Okay, that's fine. So, what I'm going to present today is an analysis of the total flows of the Austrian development activities. So, wir präsentieren und analysieren im Wesentlichen die gesamten Leistungen Österreichs an Entwicklungsländer in dieser Publikation. Bei den 15 Minuten, die ich für die Präsentation zur Verfügung habe, kann ich Ihnen lediglich ein paar Daten und ein paar Highlights präsentieren, mit denen es gelingen sollte, vielleicht Ihre Aufmerksamkeit für die Publikation zu finden. Wir haben auf der einen Seite eine Analyse und Darstellung der gesamten öffentlichen Entwicklungszusammenarbeit, also der ODA, der Official Development Assistance. Wir gehen, soweit die Daten verfügbar sind, auf die sonstigen öffentlichen Leistungen und öffentlichen gestützten Exportkredite ein, sowie auf die Leistungen zu den marktüblichen Bedingungen und stellen auch noch die Zuschüsse privater Organisationen dar. Darüber hinaus, das ist kein Teil der gesamten ODA-Darstellung der OECD, des Development Assistance Committee, aber wir finden, es ist auch eine spannende und interessante Datenquelle, stellen wir und analysieren wir auch die Remittances aus Österreich an Entwicklungsländer dar. Um gleich einmal sozusagen die öffentlichen Leistungen und die anderen gesamten Leistungen entsprechend dieser OECD-DAC Kategorisierung und Darstellung Ihnen ganz kurz zu zeigen. Lassen Sie sich bitte nicht von den vielen Zahlen hier verirren oder verwirren. Es gibt, das ist eine Tabelle, die wir dargestellt haben gleich am Anfang, die ich jetzt dann noch ein bisschen ergänzt habe, weil wir das Problem haben, dass bei der Erstellung der Daten noch nicht alle Daten vollständig vorhanden waren für das Jahr 2020. In der Zwischenzeit sind mehr Daten bei der OECD präsentiert worden, die es uns erlauben, ein bisschen intensiver auf die Gesamtflüsse einzugehen. Daher finden Sie eine detaillierte Analyse in der Broschüre von den Jahren 2015 bis 2019 und dort, wo es möglich ist, auch Daten zu 2020. Jetzt möchte ich nur ganz kurz eingehen, weil das Spannendste ist auf das Jahr 2020. Wir haben hier das Problem, dass heuer Österreich das erste Mal nach diesem neuen System der OECD, der Grant Equivalence und nicht mehr nach den Finanzflüssen, also alles das, was ausbezahlt wurde, meldet. Und daher haben wir sozusagen zwei Daten. Die fetten Zahlen hier sind quasi in Fortsetzung des gesamten Systems von früher, die Financial Flows, und die anderen Zahlen oben drüber sind Grant Equivalent. Jetzt nur ganz einfach, wir haben derzeit rund 1,1 Milliarden an ODA und nach dem Ground Equivalent System und 1,16 nach dem Financial Flow System. Das wäre sozusagen 0,29%. Das ist auch die Zahl, die in Österreich publiziert wurde und die OECD publiziert wurde. Hätten wir es nach dem Financial Flow System berechnet, dann hätten wir 0,31%. Das Spannende ist aber für das Jahr 2020, wenn wir uns die gesamten Leistungen, also die Total Flows ansehen, dann fehlen uns hier noch die Zuschüsse der privaten Hilfsorganisationen. Das macht aber nichts. Wir können zumindest, wir sehen deutlich, dass bei den sonstigen öffentlichen Leistungen gibt es im Vergleich zu 2019 einen Rückgang. Bei den Exportkrediten gibt es sogar Rückzahlungen, die aber eigentlich in den letzten Jahren immer vorhanden waren, allerdings 2020 weitaus mehr. Und bei den privaten Leistungen zu marktüblichen Bedingungen sehen wir Rückzahlungen in der Höhe von 1,3 Milliarden Euro. Bei den Zuschüssen privater Hilfsorganisationen wissen wir, dass die angestiegen sind. Wir rechnen hier circa mit 160 Millionen, trotz Covid. Das ist durchaus eine interessante Steigerung. Das heißt, letztendlich bei den Gesamtleistungen, derzeit gibt die OECD 243 Millionen an Rückzahlungen aus. Wenn wir die 160 circa abrechnen, werden wir circa bei 83 Milliarden an Rückzahlungen firmieren. Insofern ist das eine sehr spannende Zahl. Wenn wir die Gesamtleistungen 2015 bis 2019 anschauen, waren wir hier doch zwischen 4 Milliarden und 2 Milliarden. Und jetzt im Jahr 2020, was durchaus auch sozusagen ganz deutlich darauf hinweist, dass vor allem die privaten Leistungen in der Zeit von Covid dramatisch zurückgegangen sind, darauf hinweist, dass hier die Oder-Leistungen zumindest in den letzten Jahren halbwegs stabil, zwar in Österreich auf einem geringen Level, aber trotzdem stabil sind, während alle anderen Leistungen sehr volatil sind. Wenn wir uns die Zuschüsse privater Organisationen ansehen, ganz kurz, dann kann ich Ihnen hier anhand dieser Tabelle einfach nur einen Eindruck geben, von 2015 bis 2019, 2020, die Daten sind noch nicht freigegeben. Da sieht man zumindest recht deutlich, dass mit 146 Millionen Euro die Spenden, Fundraising und anderen privaten Aktivitäten der österreichischen NGOs durchaus beachtlich sind und in den letzten Jahren eigentlich auf einem gleichen Niveau geblieben sind. Für 2020 rechnen wir mit einer Erhöhung. Was wir hier sehen, ist, dass in Österreich eigentlich auf der einen Seite die Mitgliedsorganisationen der KOO, der Koordinierungsstelle der bischöflichen Entwicklungszusammenarbeit und Mission, dass die einen zentralen Stellenwert einnehmen und insgesamt sozusagen die 10 größten Einrichtungen in Österreich eigentlich einen großen Prozentsatz abdecken, obwohl es relativ viele auch kleine Einrichtungen gibt. Aber wir haben es eigentlich mit großen Spendenorganisationen zu tun, die in Österreich durchaus relevant sind für die private Entwicklungszusammenarbeit. Und der dritte Teil, den ich hier noch beleuchten und anschauen möchte, sind die Remittances. Bei den Remittances ist es durchaus interessant. Hier gibt es die ersten vorläufigen Daten für 2020, die wir soweit berücksichtigt haben. Das basiert auf einer Meldung der Österreichischen Nationalbank, die die Gastarbeiterüberweisungen insgesamt versucht zu erheben und zu schätzen. Und wenn wir aus diesen Meldungen herausrechnen, die österreichischen Gastarbeiterüberweisungen an Entwicklungsländer, dann hat das trotz Covid und trotz sozusagen der Probleme, die ja in erster Linie sozusagen auch Gastarbeiter und Migrantinnen auch in Österreich besonders treffen, ist eigentlich 2019 der Anteil der Gastarbeiterüberweisungen mit 360 Millionen sehr hoch gewesen und 2020 nur geringfügig abgesunken. Wenn wir uns aber die gesamten Gastarbeiterüberweisungen ansehen, dann betrugen die 2020 ca. 950 Millionen Euro. Interessant ist hier natürlich, dass hier die meisten Überweisungen an europäische Länder gehen, an die klassischen Kooperationspartner, wenn man so möchte, und auch die Herkunftsländer der Gastarbeiter. Also angefangen von Serbien, Ungarn, Polen und so weiter. Hier gibt es viel größere Leistungen. An LDCs, an die wenigsten entwickelten Ländern, gehen allerdings nur geringe Gastarbeiterüberweisungen. An die Schwerpunktländer der österreichischen Entwicklungszusammenarbeit gehen sozusagen auch sehr wenig Überweisungen. Das ist vernachlässigbar. Insgesamt aber sind die Gastarbeiterüberweisungen an Entwicklungsländer mit 356 Millionen eine beachtliche Größe, die, wenn man so möchte, durchaus mehr Finanzmittel darstellen als die öffentliche Entwicklungszusammenarbeit, das ADA-Budget und die privaten Leistungen der privaten Organisationen gemeinsam ausmachen. Das waren einfach nur ein paar Highlights, die ich Ihnen hier versucht habe, anhand von Tabellen und Zahlen darzustellen. Mehr Informationen und Details finden Sie in der vorher dargestellten Broschüre und ich hoffe, dass Sie hier sozusagen mehr an Informationen finden, die Ihnen auch bei der Beurteilung der Leistungen im internationalen Vergleich behilflich sind. Besten Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Damit gebe ich gleich zurück zu Margarita.
Danke, Michael. Many thanks to Michael Obrovsky. There is some time left now for a couple of questions. You can ask questions in German or in English. Please raise your hand if you would like to speak. Otherwise, you can also write questions in the chat if you wish. There is a question in the chat by Werner Ratzer. Wie stellen sich die österreichischen ODA-Beiträge im Vergleich zu internationalen Trends dar?
Soll ich gleich darauf antworten?
Bitte, ja.
Wenn wir das jetzt konkret auf die Covid-Krise beziehen, dann fehlen uns hier noch die genauen Detailzahlen. Die OECD hat zwar bei ihrer vorläufigen Press Release im April die ersten Zahlen dargestellt. Österreich ist aber insgesamt jetzt, wenn ich mir die ODA hernehme, im internationalen Vergleich im unteren Feld zu finden. Der internationale Vergleich sieht seit vielen Jahren für Österreich nicht allzu toll aus. Details zu den speziellen Covid-Programmen werden wahrscheinlich erst Anfang nächsten Jahres zu erwarten sein. Generell glaube ich aber auch, soweit wir auch andere Datenquellen haben, schaut es international wahrscheinlich vergleichbar aus, so dass vor allem die Direktinvestitionen und die privaten Exportkredite anlässlich der Covid-Krise selbstverständlich stärker zurückgegangen sind als beispielsweise die ODA-Leistungen.
Danke. Hier kommt noch eine Frage von Herrn Reininger. Hat es innerhalb der bilateralen ODA größere Verschiebungen zwischen den Unterpositionen gegeben?
Naja, da hat es durchaus Veränderungen oder Verschiebungen gegeben. Im Jahr 2019, für 20 habe ich noch nicht alle Detailzahlen, aber zumindest kann man sagen, im Jahr 2019 sind vor allem die Leistungen für Asylwerber und Asylwerberinnen stark zurückgegangen, weil die haben ja eigentlich seit 2015 die bilaterale ODA sehr stark geprägt. Das ist aber radikal zurückgegangen. Wir hatten hier 2016 einen Anteil, letztendlich insgesamt waren das fast 540 Millionen. Wir sind jetzt für die Asylwerberinnen im Geberland bei circa 27 Millionen. Also hier ist der Anteil stark zurückgegangen. Es sind allerdings sozusagen natürlich auch die indirekten Studienplatzkosten nach wie vor mit rund 118 Millionen, 119 Millionen, ein relativ hoher Anteil, währenddessen langsam sozusagen auch eine Erhöhung stattgefunden hat bei den ADA-Budgets, vor allem natürlich auch beim AKF, bei der Katastrophenhilfe und beim Katastrophenfonds des Außenministeriums, der ja über die ADA abgewickelt wird. Also hier hat sich tatsächlich in den letzten Jahren, seit 2015, das Budget der ADA und des AKFs sichtbar und signifikant vergrößert im Vergleich zu den Vorjahren. International ist der Anteil natürlich nach wie vor relativ gering. Der Anteil dieser gestaltbaren Zusammenarbeit, wenn man so möchte.
Dankeschön.
Weitere Details bitte unserer Broschüre zu entnehmen. Wir haben auf Seite 80 eine relativ große Matrix, wo man die Details ablesen kann in Euro. Danke.
Vielen Dank, Michael. Eine Frage ist noch hereingekommen. Gibt es Daten zu Remittances, die über privatwirtschaftliche Transfersysteme, zum Beispiel Western Union, geleistet werden?
Also, soweit ich weiß, gehen in diese Schätzungen der Nationalbank auch die Geldüberweisungen mehr oder weniger mit ein. Inwieweit da die Privaten jetzt in der Schätzung integriert sind, kann ich schwer sagen, aber ich gehe davon aus, nachdem Geldtransfers ja sozusagen dann auch gemeldet werden müssen, kann das sein, dass das sehr wohl in der Schätzung drinnen ist. Was auf alle Fälle nicht drinnen ist, ist rein private Systeme. Ja? Also es gibt ja verschiedene private, jetzt nicht über Firmen wie Western Union, sondern privat organisierte Sachen. Das ist alles drinnen. Man muss davon ausgehen, dass bei den Remittances gibt es verschiedene Methoden, wie das erhoben wird. Aber da ist natürlich sozusagen, das ist das Minimum. Da wird sicherlich, wenn man private Sachen noch dazu nimmt, wird das sogar noch mehr sein.
Dankeschön. Gibt es noch Fragen oder auch Kommentare? Sie können gerne auch ein mündliches Statement abgeben oder eine Frage stellen, die Hand heben und sich kurz das Mikrofon einschalten und die Kamera.
Vielleicht, wenn ich da noch ein bisschen was dazu sagen kann, ich finde es für 2020 vor allem sehr interessant und sehr spannend, dass wir seit Jahren insgesamt bei den Total Flows sozusagen eigentlich eine Minuszahl, eine Rückzahlung haben. Das heißt, mehr Gelder aus Entwicklungsländern nach Österreich fließen, als von Österreich in Entwicklungsländer, entsprechend der statistischen Daten.
Danke noch für den Hinweis auf diesen sehr interessanten Punkt. Ja, dann kann ich Sie vielleicht noch darauf hinweisen, wenn Ihnen noch Fragen zu diesem spezifischen Thema der Finanzflüsse Österreichs einfallen, können Sie die auch noch während der Veranstaltung in den Chat schreiben. Und wir werden sie sammeln und versuchen dann in der Q&A-Session am Ende der Veranstaltung insgesamt zu beantworten. Ja, dann hätten wir jetzt Zeit für eine kurze Pause. Ich möchte Sie bitten, alle auf meiner Uhr 8 Minuten um 17:40 Uhr wieder zurückzukommen und dann gehen wir zu unserem zweiten Teil über der Panel Discussion. Jetzt ist Zeit für kurz mal aufstehen, Beine vertreten und sich zu erfrischen. Eine kurze Pause. Dankeschön. it is my pleasure now to welcome our panelists. Let me briefly introduce them to you. Richard Kozul-Wright is Director of the Globalization and Development Strategies Division in UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. He has worked at the United Nations in both New York and Geneva. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cambridge, and he has published widely on economic issues. Our second panelist is Jan Grumiller. Jan is a postdoc researcher at ÖFSE and holds a doctoral degree in economics from the University of Business and Economics in Vienna. His research focuses on global value chains, analysis and industrial policy. And since the outbreak of COVID-19, he has been particularly focusing on global value chains resilience and reshoring with a specialization on pharmaceutical and medical product sectors. And as our third panelist, I'm delighted to welcome Pauline Veron. Pauline is a policy officer at the European Center for Development Policy Management, where she conducts policy research in the European External Affairs and Migration programs. She has written extensively on EU development cooperation and foreign policy, including migration. Welcome to all of you. May I address the first question to you, Dr. Kozul-Wright? You have worked extensively on the macroeconomic and financial implications of the COVID crisis on the global south. Can you describe which are the most important implications and what kind of actions they do require as response?
Sure, Margarita, thanks for OeFSE for the opportunity. Yeah, I mean, obviously we are at the moment in a global recovery of some kind. We estimate vary from 5 to 6%. But that kind of average figure is not very helpful as it hides huge asymmetries and a good deal of uncertainty surrounding country prospects and regional prospects. And one of the real sources of asymmetry and uncertainty right now with profound impacts on the global south is of course the extent of the vaccine rollout. I guess I don't need to go through the figures, but they are extreme in their asymmetry. We've tried to make an assessment of what that means for the developing world. Other institutions have as well. I guess we take a couple of conclusions, I think, from this failure. One is that public-private partnerships are not the way to handle global health problems, that's for sure. That has been a fairly blatant failure in this crisis. I think the other one that is a disturbing one for us is that advanced economies seem to be only interested in multilateral solutions when it suits them, rather than responding to the problem at hand. That's obviously the case with the issue around the waiver at the WTO. And the consequences of this are profound, not only for the developing countries that have been denied access to vaccines, but also, as we're finding out with the Omicron virus, there are blowback likelihoods from not having extensive access to vaccines across the globe. So that's clearly a very important issue for many countries in the South. A second one that's attracting a lot of attention right now and worries policymakers in the South for all kinds of reasons is the growing threat of inflationary pressures. We've been very strong in suggesting that this has much more to do with disruption than it does to excess demand. But there are some developing countries where there are strong inflationary pressures, Turkey, Brazil being prominent amongst them, more to do with, significantly to do with exchange rate pressures. I think the worry, for us at least, in terms of looking ahead, is that inflation. We worry that inflationary pressure, which is not a 1970s phenomena in any stretch of the imagination, but the response, if there is a tightening, an undue tightening response to inflationary pressure in advanced economies, then that will have again significant negative impact on developing countries through higher interest rates, through capital outflows, etc. And so that's something that we do worry about significantly. There's an element in the price story that speaks to a third issue. I mean, people don't ask who sets prices, and the answer is not markets in some generic sense, but it's firms. And firms have become increasingly concentrated. Increasingly powerful players have now dominated key markets in the global economy. And the use of monopoly power is a particularly worrying trend across a number of activities in the global economy. Maybe that's something that Jan will pick up in the questions around global value chains and the issues around decoupling, which again is an issue that is of concern to developing countries. The role of China, what the pandemic tells us about the role of China in the global economy, the role of value chains, the issues around reshoring are obviously of concern to developing countries at the moment, and I think it's an issue that we need to have. And so as a final point, I guess, where that kind of points to, and the big issue for us in looking at the current state of affairs and looking ahead, is the worry that we're in a divergent stage of the global economy. The ability of the advanced economies to respond to this kind of shock with appropriate fiscal and monetary measures is clearly very different from what most developing countries have available to them in terms of policy response, policy space. So that old north-south divide, which is of course hardwired into the UNCTAD view of the world, certainly seems to have been exposed and exaggerated by the pandemic. But it's not just a cross-country, divergence is not just a cross-country issue. Obviously, we've seen very significant shifts in income distribution within countries. Wealth inequality in particular has risen dramatically over the course of the last 18 to 20 months. We know the figures about the rise of billionaires and the role of asset price increases in that story. And that has all kinds of damaging and dangerous ramifications. And there are also important sectoral differences, which again have important implications for developing countries. The difference between manufacturing and service sectors, the exaggerated role of finance, the exaggerated role of sectors of the economy that rely on intellectual property rights, etc. So there's some real sectoral tensions also that have, I think, significant implications for developing countries. And underpinning all this issue for at least a lot of our constituency is how these might play out in a world that has become extremely indebted. Over the last 20 or 30 years, this is not a new phenomenon, but a growth process that has become extremely dependent on increasing levels of debt to keep it going, and the fragilities and the uncertainties that produces, the threat of deflationary pressures, etc. The danger of a lost decade that we talked about before the pandemic hit, but has become much more threatening, we think, as a consequence of the crisis itself. So there's some real kind of anxieties, I think, for facing policymakers, given these kind of tensions that have emerged with the spread of the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kozul-Wright. Well, I've heard some, let's say, provocative and also worrying terms here, like growing asymmetries, growing inequalities, and widening north-south divide. And also something which is really worrying, that a kind of consumerist attention of northern countries to multilateralism. I found this really interesting. Well, Jan, can I pose the next question to you? You're an expert on global value change, and you have studied thoroughly the implications of COVID-19 on them at global level. as I understand, and this resonates with what we just have heard, the discussion on resilience, on global value chain resilience, is mostly undertaken from a perspective of the global north and a focus on the global north. But what implications are there for the global south, and what possibilities are there?
Yes, thank you, Margarita, and also Richard for your discussion. Yeah, it's definitely true that the perspective on global value chain resilience is mostly discussed from the perspective of the global north. But before maybe we discuss what the implications are for the global south, let's maybe look briefly at, okay, what are the key issues with regard to global value chain resilience. And what we did in our contribution, we mostly focused on critical products, mostly medical products and pharmaceuticals, not necessarily vaccines. Of course, vaccines are now the most important issue, but there are many other critical products, I think, that need to be discussed. And as you all know, there have been a variety of different COVID-19 induced supply chain interruptions because of lockdowns, export restrictions, and other reasons. But I think it's also important to see that the COVID-19 pandemic only highlighted an already existing problem. Namely that since the emergence and expansion of global value chains since the 1980s, multinational corporations have focused on structuring supply chains in the most efficient way and not in the most sustainable or resilient way. And for that reason, we find that many global supply chains lack resilience. And there are three key issues in that context. One of these is single sourcing practices, which means that firms often try to source inputs from only one or few suppliers in order to reduce supply chain management costs, which of course is an issue if this firm faces any type of production or trade disruption. There are regional clusters, which are also a major issue. Of course, we have seen this because of regional lockdowns, export restrictions, or regional catastrophes potentially in the future. These regional clusters that have emerged in many value chains could be a major problem. And finally, also just-in-time manufacturing, which is kind of the go-to strategy of most multinational firms. What is just-in-time manufacturing? It basically means that firms aim to reduce the production and delivery times along the supply chain with the goal to reduce stocks and therefore costs. And the reduction of stocks clearly limits the robustness of supply chains, right? For example, in case of trade disruptions and so on. And we have seen this in many value chains also to be a major issue. Okay, so in our contribution, we highlight that these issues exist in the case of various medical products and pharmaceutical supply chains. For example, we have seen that the security of supply for medical products during the pandemic was undermined, since almost all medical gloves are imported from Malaysia, for example, and there has been a regional lockdown in Malaysia. And yeah, I will not go into the details, but for various products, there are specific problems that need to be addressed. We have seen, for example, single sourcing strategies in the case of semiconductors for ventilators has limited the upscaling of production during the crisis, and so on. Yeah, and maybe also with regard to pharmaceuticals in general, and not only vaccines. In particular, in the case of generics, and this has been a long debate. That there are, regional clusters and single sourcing, which limits the security of supply. And this also affects the global south and increasingly also the global north. That's something that we have seen in the last decade. And, the COVID-19 pandemic only kind of initiated the public attention to an already existing problem. So for just one example, there was an outbreak where penicillin in Brazil was needed and it was just not enough available, right? But there are many other examples. So I think that's one of the major issues too. We are only talking about the current prevalent problem of vaccines, but actually we have to look at, a broad range of issues from the perspective of the global south. The discussion that's going on in the global north currently is that the problem of supply chain disruptions has triggered a debate on how to improve supply chain resilience and security of supply. And here the idea is mostly to promote stockpiling of critical products, as well as supply chain diversification and redundancy. So what does that mean? So supply chain diversification and redundancy means that firms should source from multiple firms and regions, as well as increase stocks of key inputs and so on. But I think the major issue of the current debate in the global north, at least, but of course this is also to some extent related to global south, is that yet not really clear how this will be incentivized or regulated, right? So it's extremely costly in many value chains to just start multiple sourcing or to start sourcing from different regions. A lot of times you only have one supplier for a specific input and so on. So there are many problems attached to it. It can be extremely expensive. And there's a lot of discussion. Okay, we should do this and that, but how it's done, it's not really clear yet. But in the case of critical products, including many medical and pharmaceuticals, nearshoring is also debated, as Richard already said. That means that in some countries, including the US and the EU, they are contemplating to bring back the production of selected critical and strategic goods to or near the EU and the US. And in the US, it's clear that the discussion in the context of geopolitical conflicts with China and in the context of the new Biden administration are already much more concrete compared to what's going on in the EU. Here, the debates are rather vague, I would argue. So now I've talked a long time already about the global north. So what are the main issues for the global south? So for the global north, the security supply issue is mostly a question of regulation and resource allocation. But for the global south, of course, has a lot of constraints on the one hand, and they will also be highly influenced by the policies in the global north that target supply chain resilience. So the most important constraint, of course, include the low per capita income, which of course limits, for example, the potential for expensive stockpiling strategies. But also the low production capacities of critical products in most countries are, of course, I think that's clear, a major issue. So most countries in the global south, in particular in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, are completely import dependent with regard to basically all critical medical and pharmaceutical products. And we have seen in the case of vaccine how problematic this is, and I don't think I have to add too much to this. But depending on future crises, this may also be a problem for many other critical products. So I think what we need to take away from the COVID-19 crisis, to expand the discussion, not only for vaccines, even though of course vaccines are extremely important, but also look at other products, potentially critical products. So it is, I think, important that the global north complies with policy coherence for development. Since, for example, reshoring could have important effects on the global south. Richard already mentioned it, as I said, depending on the country's position in value chains, of course, right? So reshoring is likely to negatively affect countries in the global south that currently produce products that are potentially reshored. But on the other hand, in particular, import-dependent countries could also benefit from policy-induced overcapacities and lower prices. Right, so I think it's very hard to generalize reshoring will do this and that, but you have to really look at what is the product, what's the value chain, what are the effects. So now we're starting the discussions in the global north about reshoring. From the onset, we have to take into account, okay, what are the implications for the global south? And with regard to policy recommendations for the global south, I think I will not go all over the policies we discuss in our contribution, since I already talked quite a long time, I think. But I will only highlight, that given the financial and production constraints, regional cooperation in stockpiling and building up production capacities, in particular because, for many products, you have, the economies of scale and so on, that will be incremental. And that these efforts, of course, should be supported by the global north. But we see currently in the COVID vaccine discussion that, it's difficult. Financially, there should be financial support, of course, but also with regard to technology transfers. And of course, we have heard it a lot of times today already, introducing waivers for intellectual property rights and patents. And in particular, in the case of vaccines, I think it's now clear that vaccine inequalities can only be solved once vaccine manufacturing is distributed. Yeah, I think so. I talked already quite a lot of time, so maybe there are I took already a lot of time, so maybe there are more questions and we go into that in more detail.
Thank you, Jan. Yes, complementary and very interesting contribution. And there was a link to the policy level, which we are going to tackle now. You stressed that there should be a consideration of the principle of policy coherence for development in the response policies of the Global North with regard to the requirements of the Global South. So, Pauline, can I ask the third question to you? You're a specialist, an expert on development cooperation, development policy of the European Union. What is the response of the European Union to the crisis? I mean, with regard to development policy, and do you think that there will be something like a lasting effect or a lasting effect in terms of potential shifts in European Union development policy?
Thanks, Margarita, and thanks a lot for having me as part of this discussion. It's been very interesting so far. So I won't go into details on the impact of COVID-19 on human development, because I'm pretty sure all of you are very familiar with it, but the context and the major impact COVID has had on health and education and various sectors that are key to achieving the SDGs. And I will spend a bit more time though on the response of the EU to this context and this impact. And to respond to your question, Margarita, yes, I think the pandemic has had an impact, long-term impact on the EU's external action and development policy, although I will nuance that a bit further in my presentation. Just quickly, the EU's response to COVID has been multifaceted in the sense that the EU leveraged its research and innovation assets, it mobilized funds and catalyzed multilateral action from various partners. And one of its most notable features of this response has been the Team Europe package that you might have heard about, which was launched in April 2020 and which aim to combine resources from the EU institutions, member states, and financial institutions. I think it's brought about 40 billion euros in resources so far. And it had three pillars, and one of them was to tackle the social and economic consequences of the pandemic, which got the most funds. And the other two were strengthening health, water, and sanitation systems, and then finally the emergency response to humanitarian needs, and both of them got a bit less funds. And this response very much focused on the Africa and the neighborhood. What I want to stress here is that, and this is not new since the pandemic, it was the case before, but the EU likes to promote itself as the lead or a major donor, right? We've seen that in the pandemic. We've seen that the EU used the Team Europe label to say that it's the major contributor to the COVAX facility, for instance. And here I'd like to bring two caveats. And one of them is the fact that the EU's response has been criticized, the EU's financial response at least, because it was mostly reallocation of funds rather than bringing fresh money. And linked to that, there's a problem of transparency where it's sometimes a bit hard to know exactly where the money, how much money has been allocated to what. That's one caveat. And the other one is that the EU's ability to follow up on its ambitions and its commitments to solidarity during the pandemic has been limited. And then there are several reasons for that. And one of them is that EU member states are still very much struggling to find a balance between protecting their own citizens and ensuring a global fair response to the pandemic. And the pandemic very much remains a test for the EU's international ambitions, especially in the area of global health. We see that very clearly now with the unequal access to vaccines, which has been mentioned several times already, and I'm sure will be part of the discussion. And beyond this immediate response to the pandemic, I also wanted to highlight the fact that human development has gained some traction in EU policymaking. It has been reiterated in various EU policy frameworks in the past year, and it is a very strong European Commission priority. So there is an understanding that these investments in human development will be part of building, or need to be part at least, of building back better. And also an understanding that this is very much in the EU's interest. I think that has also been mentioned by Richard a bit. Given the spillover of the pandemic, there's also very strong understanding that the investments in partner countries are also in the interest of the global north. So the pandemic did bring some innovations to the EU's external engagement, but this was not only justified by the support to partner countries, but also very much by internal interests. And here I want to mention the fact that the EU's response to the pandemic was very much rooted in a drive to position itself as a global player in a competitive and uncertain environment. And the Team Europe approach was clearly an attempt by the EU to bring more visibility to its action and to counter other international players in the response to COVID. I do want to highlight those some opportunities and then in the current context, and then one of them that you might be aware of is that the year 2021 opens a new cycle for the EU's international cooperation with a new budget and a new multi-annual financial framework for 2021 to 2027. The EU now has a new financial instrument for external action, which was agreed upon earlier this year, which is called a very difficult name, the Neighborhoods Development and International Cooperation Instrument, NDICI, which is also called Global Europe now, much easier to pronounce. And it basically merges 10 previous instruments that existed before for development policy and external action into one broad instrument that is 79.5 billion euros, and that merges foreign policy and development objectives into one more coherent instrument, let's say, bringing together different strands of the EU's action. And the programming of the resources for this instrument has been ongoing now for the past year and a half, more or less. And we've seen that at ECDPM as a key opportunity to put human development more at the forefront of EU external action for the next 7 years. It is a key moment in the EU cycle, and given the major impacts the pandemic has had in partner countries, this is a key moment to show what the EU's priorities are. Whether this will be the case remains to be seen. The outcomes of this programming process are not public yet. We'll probably know more about it next year, but this is something to monitor in my view. Parallel to that, the Team Europe approach, which was, as I said, the response to the pandemic, has now become a more long-standing feature of EU external action. And then Team Europe initiatives have been designed at partner country level to, as I said, to provide visibility to these action, but also to provide that collective action between various parts of the EU, including member states and financial institutions, to support the EU's priorities, including digital, the green transition, the post-COVID recovery. And this is meant to bring a more, pooling financial resources and member states' expertise at partner country level to bring transformative impact and bring more provide more leverage to the EU also. Whether these Team Europe initiatives will actually lead to more collaboration between member states on the ground, again, is something that will have to be seen and monitored. It's still a very new concept. And linked to these two opportunities that are ongoing right now, I wanted to highlight a few challenges that are linked to the EU's development policy right now. And one of them is the fact that there's a high number of priorities on the EU's agenda right now. including the green and digital transitions, migration, strategic autonomy, which very much links to Jan's presentation. These are concepts that we hear a lot in the EU bubble now. And as a result, they take a lot of political energy away from other policy areas like human development, which, as I said, it is a high priority for the European Commission, but it does take a less political energy right now. And we see more focused at partner country level on the green transition, for instance, right now, and climate, which is obviously a very important priority, but not the only one for partner countries. I think that the challenge for the EU will be in the next few months and years will be to be able to link those traditional human development sectors, which are sometimes seen as charity, with more strategic EU priorities like digital and green, as I mentioned. There are very clear linkages to be made between digitalization and health and education, for instance, or health and the green transition. So there are key opportunities in my view. Whether that will actually happen, I think is a bit unclear, and it will require some change in the EU's programming of its resources and more smarter investments at partner country level to be able to make those linkages. So very quickly, as a conclusion, my answer to your question, Margarita, would be that yes, the pandemic did bring some long-term changes in the EU's development policy and innovations, as I mentioned, around Team Europe and the EU's ways of working, more focus on certain thematic priorities, and also a sense of urgency that the EU needs to play a leading role in global affairs. But there's also very strong path dependency in the EU's development policy and cooperation. There are now strong calls for international cooperation, for a greener and fairer recovery. How Europe will respond to these calls will definitely impact its profile for the years to come. And they will also reveal how serious it is on its building back better and greener agenda. And there, I think the long-term and inclusive recovery will require strong investments in human development sectors, and that will need more than political declarations, but also smarter investments in partner countries, as I mentioned. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Pauline, for these very interesting insights into EU policy in development cooperation and also the challenges ahead. We'll stay at the policy level just for a while now. I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Wolfgang Lapuh from the Austrian Ministry for European and International Affairs for a comment from the perspective of Austrian development cooperation. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Lapuh. Let me just introduce him shortly to you. Wolfgang Lapuh is head of Department 7.2, Thematic Issues, Development Financing, Cooperation with IFIs and OECD DAC at the Austrian Federal Ministry of European and Foreign Affairs. Before that, his work at the Austrian Federal Chancellery and Foreign Ministry focused on development cooperation and Middle East policies and the Middle East peace process. He was head of the Austrian Representative Office in Ramallah from 1998 to 2002. And other regions of expertise include the Himalaya, Hindu Kush region, and Central America. And thematically, he has been working on sustainable tourism in developing countries as well. Dr. Lapuh, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting me to give some short comments on the interesting presentations that we have heard. I will try to be short. I will try to refrain myself to see it really only through the lens of development cooperation practices. I can agree with very much which has been said about the European Union's development cooperation, because the challenges are similar to us. So I will start. Maybe the researchers on the panel will agree, or maybe they won't agree. I hope they will agree that even if we have lots of information, but still we lack reliable data on many aspects, and particularly what the whole crisis might mean in the long-term consequences. But there are some things that can already be said, and from the point of view of development cooperation, if you look at the agenda 2030, unfortunately, we can already say development as a sustainable development goal 1, meaning ending poverty in all its forms and everywhere, will definitely not be achieved. Equally, sustainable development goal 2, meaning ending hunger and achieving food security, will also not be achieved. So there are real consequences that can already be seen to this crisis, which are very important for development cooperation. You have mentioned the unequal supply of vaccines, where we can contribute, where we can try to contribute, and maybe later on I can explain what we do in that context. But there is still another feature that can be said already right now. If we look at the share of vaccinated population in our partner countries, we can already say COVID-19 will be there in our partner countries for a very long time from now. So it's not something which will go away. Most of you know that we are working on the 3 years program, or finalizing the 3 years program for Austrian development cooperation at the moment. We could have dedicated the whole program to COVID-19, because the next 3 years easily it will all be COVID-19. So this is also a feature that is it's important from our point of view. I used to participate in a dialogue event between Latin American countries and the DAC member states just recently. And there was one interesting information that I got out from there. For many or most of those partner countries from Latin America, COVID-19 is the first major external crisis that they are exposed to after independence. I mean, of course, before, but after independence, this is the first. Obviously, the global financial crisis was not that didn't have such a deep impact on them as this COVID-19 does have. What does it mean for development cooperation? The slogan, our common slogan of building back better and greener has already been quoted, and it's definitely something that is guiding us. Development cooperation is dedicated to fighting poverty and trying to leave no one behind. But this COVID-19 crisis has exacerbated vulnerabilities in a very clear way, vulnerabilities in the public health systems, vulnerabilities as to environmental situations, environmental vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities in terms of poverty and unemployment. We hope to build back better. In the United Nations language, they even tried to call it building forward better and greener, meaning that we cannot go back to what we had and what we used to do. But unfortunately, we must admit, and it has been said, there seems to be some kind of recovery already. But unfortunately, I think we must admit that there is no strong evidence that this economic recovery, which is occurring in some parts of the world, is based on new and sustainable ways of working. I would love to be proven wrong, but as I said, there is no strong evidence that it might happen. In practical terms of development cooperation, of course, we look at where are the most severe negative impacts on our in our partner countries or in the groups of people that we're working with. And there are some, first of all, country-wise, the impact, of course, is the strongest on fragile states. And within the states, it's on the most vulnerable sectors of population. But among all of that, I think it's interesting to say, not interesting, it's evident that the impact is particularly strong on women and girls, on youth and on children. It's also interesting that there is a strong impact on security and on democratic development. And it's also interesting to observe, even as somehow I wouldn't call it a positive impact, but during the time of the lockdowns and so on, there were immediate decreases of water pollution, of air pollution, which means and which tells us we can do something about it. It's not that we can't do, and we can do something about ecologic developments and so on. The World Overshoot Day, or World Exhaustion Day, as it's also called, it was delayed by nearly a month last year. But as soon as economic activity recovered, we got back to the date as we had it in the year 2019, meaning 2021 is very similar to 2019. It was only 2020 that this exhaustion day really delayed. Another, also just a small indicator I have come about this, that even the efficiency of solar panels increased by a measurable and big measurable margin during the times of this lockdown, during the times of other activities, during the time of 2020. I saw the number of 8% higher effectivity of solar panels due to cleaner air and so on. If you allow me, or is my time already over, I could quickly go through what Austria has done in response to the crisis. We, of course, immediately thought, what can we do? An easy way was to contribute to international funds, UN funds that existed. Austrian development cooperation on the bilateral level proved again to be rather flexible. We could respond flexibly in our host countries and could use funds that could not be implemented, used for existing programs. Due to the problems of the COVID-19 crisis, we would use those means in other circumstances for other programs, particularly dedicated to human development, as has been mentioned before, which is more important, and we see that this is more important than ever. Other Austrian institutions responded, Ministry of Health, for example, of course, by donating vaccines and medical supply. The Austrian Development Bank reacted by offering flexible repayment schemes and not insisting on the schemes that had been agreed before, by giving bridging loans to their clients, and by loans, particularly also for the medical sector, because, as we have also heard before, it is key to have production facilities in our partner countries for medical supply, for medical products. We also contributed and try to contribute and will contribute on the level of the European Union. There are by now roughly 150 of those Team Europe initiatives, and Austrian Development Cooperation will all develop, and some of them are not really defined to the last point, but probably we might participate in roughly 20 of those 150 development Team Europe initiatives. For example, transboundary water management. This is something. This is a focus activity in our regular programming.
Dr. Lapuh, sorry for interrupting. Could you wrap up?
I will wrap up. Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, sorry. Wrapping up, I would only say there have been harsh criticism on how the development world reacted and responded. I also want to say some positive things. I mean, this crisis showed us and taught us that the world can, to a certain degree, work together on a global level. This access to COVID-19 tools, accelerator, COVAX being one of them, is something unique. I don't think this has existed ever before. So even if it has its shortcomings and so on, but this is a new way of approaching a problem, a global problem, by cooperation. This is something that I might want to say as one of the positives that we can take out of this crisis. Thank you very much. Sorry for being too long.
No problem. Thank you very much, Dr. Lapuh, for these insights into Austrian development policy and also a quite positive view on multilateralism. I guess this will be one of the topics we can now also discuss about in the question and answer sessions, which I'm opening right now. So there have already been posted 2 questions in the chat by Werner Ratzer, one to Richard Kozul-Wright and one to Pauline Veron. I will read them aloud. Question to Richard Kozul-Wright: given the crisis of international cooperation and governance mechanisms in tackling the crisis, what developments do you see in LDCs in least developed countries in response to the crisis? Do you see initiatives for strengthening, e.g., for example, South-South cooperation or regional cooperation in promoting regional value chains? And the second question to Pauline: given the new German government's international development agenda and the upcoming French elections in 2022, would you see possibilities for strengthening a more coordinated and coherent EU development response to the crisis? What trajectories for EU policy on international cooperation do you envision against this background? So we have 2 questions. I would suggest that you respond to these questions. And in the meantime, if someone else wants to ask a question, please post them in the chat or raise your hand and we will hand the floor over to you. Richard, would you like to start?
Sure, Margarita, thanks. Well, it's a timely question, of course, on LDCs because we have a UN LDC 5 conference that will take place in Doha next month. So that's going to be an issue that kind of resonates with the work that we do. Just a context, I got to say that 2021 was a bad year for multilateralism on several fronts. I mean, it's not just the vaccine issue, which on any account has been a disaster. But if we look at the G20 initiative around the debt service suspension initiative, for example, which given that developing countries have accumulated an additional $500 billion worth of debt to get through this crisis, offering anything between 10 and 15 billion in debt service suspension, which is what the initiative has done, is pretty pitiful in light of the scale of the challenge that developing countries actually are facing. And it's not even debt relief, it's suspension. They're gonna have to pay it back at some later date when things get back to normal. When I went to Glasgow, so my first COP. I mean, the lack of ambition around financing, mitigation, and particularly adaptation, but mitigation. The refusal to talk about loss and damage. These are pretty profound challenges that developing countries face, and that clearly the multilateral system as it's currently constituted is not taking these issues seriously. The advanced economies can't muster $100 billion in 10 years. Developing countries say they need $1.3 trillion in annual financing to meet these challenges. The gap is enormous in that respect. And I think, you know, the problems with the trading system and the WTO, we had the difficulty of holding the WTO meeting, obviously, last month, but there's no agreement on any of the major issues under discussion in the WTO. They're all contested, and they all, to a large extent, fall along developing country lines. So it's tough to see multilateralism in that context as coming out of 2021 with in glowing colors. I think the opposite is the case. And of course, in that world, it's the most vulnerable that get damaged the most, clearly. I mean, LDCs and the V20 countries, it's not just LDCs. We just held UNCTAD 15 in Barbados, and the island economies are particularly vulnerable for reasons that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And they feel that their voice is being completely neglected in these discussions. So yeah, these are the countries that are going to be damaged. I mean, we do take in response to the question, some optimism from certain types of South-South arrangements that have emerged over the last decade, in particular, in the context of financing, both short-term financing and longer-term financing, although they're not yet on the scale that is required. You know, obviously, it will be interesting to watch how the European agenda, which is large, you know, which one has to say is to some extent designed in response to the Belt and Road Initiative of China. That's quite clear. I don't think, as it's currently constituted, it will match up to the Chinese. I don't think you can simply present that agenda as a human development agenda in countries where 60% or more of the workforce is working in informal conditions, in informal labor market, and that's the case for most of these countries. Talk about human development is not the issue. Jobs is the issue. That's the big issue for most developing countries. Unless you have an agenda that is linked to productive investment and jobs, you don't have much of an agenda at all. I'm sorry. And I'm not convinced that the Belt and Road necessarily does that either. It's heavily infrastructure-oriented. Infrastructure projects are not necessarily job-creating, although the linkages and the spillover effects, I think, can be significant if done properly, and infrastructure is a critical part of any sort of sustainable agenda. But you know, that's the reality for most developing countries, and particularly for LDCs. And so in that context, issues around structural transformation, the deindustrialization of the South, including LDCs. I mean, if you want to help women, if the game is improving a lot of women, creating good industrial jobs actually is a very good way of doing that. We did that research in the Trade and Development Report back in 2017. Women have been damaged in the South, including LDCs, by premature deindustrialization and the loss of decent industrial jobs. So, I mean, these are the issues that need to be on the table if we're going to have a European, a coherent, balanced, and effective European agenda to help the LDCs and tackle the kind of problems that they face.
Thank you very much, Richard. Pauline, would you like to respond to Werner's question?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the question. I think it's very timely. I think it's very positive that the new German government is very committed to to European cooperation and to development policy in general. We have strong commitments in the coalition agreement, so I think it is definitely a very good signal. As for the French elections, I think we'll have to see what the result is. I think at this stage it's very unclear, and it could go in various directions in terms of commitment to European cooperation and commitment to international cooperation in general. So I think this will be quite decisive. The French will have, they will hold a rotating EU presidency in the first semester of 2022. It is a bit unfortunate that the French elections is taking place in the middle of this presidency, because the EU presidencies are usually a good opportunity to put topics on the agenda and to push some priorities. And it's very likely that, you know, the French will push a lot of their priorities in the first 3 months of their presidency, and then will be a lot of political energy will be going into the election. So that's a bit unfortunate, I think, for development and international cooperation, as the French and the Germans do drive a lot of topics in the European Union. At the same time, I want to point out that those are only 2 member states out of 27. I don't think any of these elections have a major impact or a long-term impact, I think, on EU, more coordination in EU development cooperation. I think some of the trends I've been talking about in my presentation, like the Team Europe approach, will be long-standing features of EU development cooperation. So there will be some continuity, no matter what the result of the French election is. But it's true that we can't deny that domestic politics also these days drive a lot of international cooperation. So those are things to watch out. But the last thing I want to point out is I think the whether we'll see more coordinated and coherent development cooperation in the future also, in my opinion, will very much depend on the trajectory of the crisis domestically in the EU, in the sense that we've seen, when the crisis erupted in 2020, at the height of the crisis, the coordination between member states was at the lowest. It was very much a crisis situation. There was no coordination, no coherence in the approach. And when the crisis settled a bit, the EU managed to come up with a Team Europe approach and more coordination. So I think we'll have to also watch for the evolution of the pandemic in the next few months, because this will also to some extent determine how the EU and its member states react or act internationally. We can't dissociate the two, I think.
Thank you very much, Pauline. There is another question in the chat by Mr. Reininger to Mr. Lapuh. I'm going to read it out. According to figures provided by the European Commission on EU member states ODA in 2020 versus 2019, the increase of the Austrian ODA was marginal when compared with increases relative to GNI by, for example, Sweden, Belgium, Germany, even though Austria started from a far lower level. In fact, faced with the global pandemic, this was very disappointing. For 2021, the bulk of the envisaged increase has been for debt relief only, Somalia and Sudan, for example, finally not taking place yet. On which side do you see the main political resistance to more decisive increases as envisaged in the coalition government's program? Dr. Lapuh, would you like to respond to this?
Yes, as far as I can.
Sure.
It's a long-standing criticism of Austrian development cooperation that the figures are too low, our share is too low. There are attempts and there are efforts to increase it. There is a plan how and a path on how to increase our ODA share. Not very successful so far. The recommendation by the DAC when we were peer reviewed the last time was to increase particularly on the bilateral level, on the development cooperation that can be shaped bilaterally through ADA, for example, or through humanitarian aid. And on that level, increase has happened. The budget for the Austrian Development Agency has increased. The budget for humanitarian aid and assistance has increased relatively clear. So this is where, now seen from the point of the administration, we have been somehow successful, although we of course would wish to get higher. Other factors of ODA and other components of ODA there is no clear, there's no way to influence them directly. We always, as members of the administration, we call on the civil society, we call on the citizens that they might help us in order, particularly in the advocacy and all of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lapuh. There is another question by Werner Ratze to you. Health issues have so far not been a priority issue for Austrian development cooperation. The recent increase in the funding of the Austrian Auslandskatastrophenfonds, the funds dedicated to emergencies notwithstanding, wouldn't it be a good opportunity to introduce a new priority area, health policies, health governance, to Austrian development cooperation, given the lessons of the COVID-19 crisis? Mm-hmm. Do you see an opportunity to link up with the Austrian Health Ministry in that respect? Mm-hmm. Can I just wrap up more questions? There is another question to all panelists here. What is the position of the panelists regarding a TRIPS waiver to support global vaccine production? And what should be the Austrian position within the waiver skeptic EU in this context? So if there is another question, I would kind of sum up 3 questions. But if not, I'll give the floor back to you, the panelists. Mr. Lapuh, maybe you want to reply to the health question, yeah, and then also your position on the TRIPS waiver.
On the health question, it's somehow easy. Of course, it's understandable that there are calls for including health programs into our focus programs of development cooperation. We used to have important health programs a long time ago. Now I mean, it's all a question of expertise within the organizations that we deal with. And it's all a decision of focusing. You cannot do everything. And at some point, the decision had been taken to slowly get out of health. Of course, if there will be change in the not foreseeable future, but in the midterm future, I cannot tell you. But right now, I just want to say, right now, there are no deliberations to include health into the priority sectors of development cooperation. As I told you, the 3 years program is being worked out right now. And of course, COVID as such, the crisis as such, is extensively dealt with, but not on the level of investing in the health sector explicitly. Thank you. On the TRIPS, difficult for me to respond sincerely. I would listen to the opinions of the experts.
Thank you very much. So Jan, would you like to respond to this question, the TRIPS waiver question?
Yes, sure. I mean, the big discussion with regard to the TRIPS waiver question is, you know, the large companies that own the patents, they say, you know, it comes down to quality control and quality assurance, and it's incredibly complex, which was of course denied by many scientists. For example, the WHO chief scientist argues, you know, there's this medicines patent pool, which is a United Nations-backed organization that aims to bring back inexpensive drugs to poor countries. And, you know, they help companies to forge partnerships by identifying reliable manufacturers, assisting with regulatory approvals, and so on and so on. So, you know, in the end, I mean, of course, in favor of a TRIPS waiver. I think it is certainly possible. And, you know, it took Moderna roughly 9 months in order to ramp up production. Probably for other companies, it would take a longer time for countries in the global south, but sooner or later, and it's rather sooner than later, you should start technology transfer. You are likely to need a solution for the companies that invested a lot of money, but it's certainly a possibility. And as we have heard today, and I think what is clear to everyone is that COVID-19, it will take years, and in particular in the global south, to tackle this challenge. So yes, companies in the global north have invested and increased their capacities, but I don't see any reason why we should, wait any longer to start with technology transfer and to start ramping up production in the global south. And as I said before, at the end of my presentation, I think it's clear that vaccine inequalities can only be solved once vaccine manufacturing is distributed.
Thank you, Jan. Pauline, would you take up this question on TRIPS waiver?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's one of the clearest examples of the gap between the EU's commitments and ambitions and what it's actually doing. The EU is one of the main opponents to the TRIPS waiver. So it's a major issue for the EU's credibility, in my view. And I think this should be resolved. There's been several reasons put forward to justify this opposition. One is that it hampers innovation. Others is that there's in any case a lack of capacity in partner countries, and that technology transfer wouldn't be enough. But I think we've seen several Team Europe initiatives on vaccine manufacturing in partner countries, which is great. But this needs to be accompanied by the TRIPS waiver, in my view.
Thank you, Pauline. Richard?
Yeah, well, obviously, we supported India and South Africa in their efforts from the beginning. So that's over a year ago. So we're talking about 14 months ago when they initiated this, and that's a lost 14 months, in our opinion. Obviously, South Africa basing its initiative very strongly on its experience with the AIDS epidemic and the relaxing of WTO rules at that point in time. I mean, I think it's indefensible, really. I really do. I mean, some of the arguments don't make sense. Médecins Sans Frontières recently came out with a study that identified 100 companies worldwide that could produce the mRNA vaccine. So, I mean, there's lots of companies that in both the north and the south that could ratchet up the production of vaccines under current conditions. It's not enough for some countries. There needs to be tech transfer as well. I mean, the waiver is not a panacea. It's just a necessary part of a wider strategy to be able to do this. That was always clear from the start. So there needs to be support, obviously, beyond the waiver. And the context for this is that Pfizer, Moderna, and BioNTech will make $34 billion out of the vaccine this year. Vaccines that were largely produced thanks to public research money, in all those cases, largely thanks to public research money that was funded by taxpayers, including European, I would think probably largely European taxpayers, actually. And given that this is defined as a global public health problem, you need a global public health response. And one of those is to make sure that countries in the South are in a position to be able to produce the vaccine wherever possible under their own conditions. And it's souring multilateral relations. That there's no doubt. It's had a very negative effect on the WTO negotiations. That's clear. I think China and India are still trying to get some sort of solution in the current virtual environment in which the WTO negotiations are still proceeding. I suspect it will be resisted. That's my guess. They won't get it by the end of the year. That will have a fairly negative effect, unfortunately, on those negotiations. And that trickles through to other parts of the multilateral system, notions of good faith, of cooperate. I mean, you can talk about cooperation till you're blue in the face. When it comes to people's lives that are being affected by it and there's no sign of cooperation, that has a profound impact on the way in which people perceive that rhetoric. So to me, it's an indefensible position right now that some of the leading European countries are taking on the waiver issue.
Thank you, Richard. There is another question in the chat by Mr. Reininger. As far as I have heard, the EU argued that they would favor direct investment to start vaccine production in the global south. Has there happened anything in this respect in the meantime? Does anybody know? I would like to collect a few more questions. Are there any more questions? Because we're approaching the end. Post it in the chat or just raise your hand. Okay, in that case, I will take advantage of my position as a facilitator and ask a question myself, which I'm very interested in. Richard, you have mentioned in your introductory speech what you've called the failure of public-private partnerships, and also the fact that during the crisis we have seen a kind of confirmation and establishment of big firms as powerful players of global policy. So I'm a researcher actually in the field of education, and in the education sector it has been very clear that the public sector has to step in and provide for education for all in that case. So what I would like to ask is, isn't that time also to re-discuss about the role of state regulation, the role of the public sector in order to overcome this crisis? Is something which to me seems quite obvious, but I have been missing in discussions about education anyway, but also in broader discussion about development policy. So this is a question also to whoever wants to reply from the panel. What about a conceptual shift, a repositioning of the question of state regulation and public sector strengthening, especially with regard to human development? Okay, I'm asking again whether there is any question, because we're approaching the closure of our conference. So then we have two more questions, which I would like to invite our panelists to quickly respond to. Richard, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, I think there are Jan probably knows this better than me, but there are some initiatives, I think, involving the European Union and the African CDC to try and invest in I don't know the details of them. I mean, one of the response always from the developing country side is that and that usually involve those are public-private partnerships, often in the sense that they involve one of the major pharmaceutical players. The African countries that I know at least also say, look, we want to generate our own capacity here. This is not the last of the viruses that are going to emerge in this highly interconnected world, and they don't want to be simply dependent on some form of charity to be able to respond in a timely and effective manner. I think that's always an issue for developing, and I think it speaks anyway to your question of public-private partnerships. I don't know the educational story. It's not my area at all, Margarita, so I can't speak to that. I mean, I can give you an example that I think quite shocked me when I was at the COP. I mean, for at least the work that we do, the mitigation and the adaptation challenge across countries will have to be led by very large public investments in both those areas if it's going to be successful, for all kinds of reasons that have to do with the ineffectiveness of the price mechanism when it comes to the kind of long-term investments that we're talking about in those respects. But the response there was, as I said, there was limited response in Glasgow. There was huge excitement when Mark Carney got up and basically said, look, we have $130 trillion in financial assets at our disposal that we're going to use to solve the climate crisis. Now, anybody, including Carney himself, who knows about the nature of the contemporary financial system knows that is nonsensical. Right? These are not assets that are out there that are somehow going to be liquidated and transferred into mitigation and adaptation challenges in the South. That's just clear, given the nature in which financial markets operate. But the kind of logic of public-private partnerships is somehow that if governments use some of the hard-earned tax money to incentivize the likes of BlackRock and other private financial institutions to de-risk those areas that are risky in mitigation, and they're all risky in the developing world. Somehow money is going to flow from these sources, and it's literally nonsensical. I mean, it has no sense whatsoever. But it somehow takes responsibility away from public notions of public service, public investment, public goods, which is essentially what we're talking about, and somehow hopes that the price mechanism and government taxpayers' money to incentivize private investors will somehow solve these problems. I think that is an incredibly dangerous way of framing the scale of the investment challenge that we're talking about in the particular area of climate adaptation and mitigation. But I think it's just as true of education. I think it's true of water, which is another area where you hear this kind of language, and other types of services. And I was quite profoundly shocked by the kind of limited understanding of how contemporary private financial markets work to deal with what is a huge global public good problem.
Thank you very much, Richard. We are approaching actually the end of our conference, so I would kindly like to ask you to give short answers to these two questions that remain. Pauline, would you like to take up the question on the EU?
Yeah, no, very quickly. I'm not sure if that was the question, but there is indeed a 1 billion Team Europe initiative that was announced earlier this year that is meant to support local manufacturing capacity in Africa, for instance. And I can put the link in the chat if people want to see more details. I don't know enough details on this Team Europe initiative to assess it, but I know, it's 1 billion, and it's been including support of the European Investment Bank. My immediate comment on this would be, manufacturing capacity in Africa is key, and it's very important, but it's a very long-term effort and support that will be key maybe for the next pandemic, but we need more immediate solutions now as well. So that would be my comment, but I don't know much about this initiative, but I'll add the link.
Thank you very much. Yes, please add the link. Jan, would you like to comment?
Yes, I also don't know the details about these initiatives. Maybe just, what is the current hope maybe in the Global South is, I think, there are a lot of vaccines and medicines in clinical trials. And, I think what is clear is that many, politicians and companies in the Global South hope, that they will be cheaper and that they sooner or later will be available and maybe also easier to produce. So, for example, the protein subunit vaccines that are currently produced by Biological E. And there are also many other examples. And some companies have also pledged that they will, make the technology available. And maybe also what has not been mentioned, that some countries like Russia, they do it. Maybe, there are also many other problems attached to this, but yeah, so, okay.
Thank you very much, Jan. Dr. Lapuh, the last word to you. Would you like to comment on any of these questions?
I can just quickly confirm the issue that I know about the Team Europe initiative on the production facility. And I can also add that the Austrian Development Bank, for example, provided a loan to a production facility in Africa. So there are such efforts. But of course, the broader frame and the problem on the bigger scale, as you described it, is much more than just this response.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much for this really interesting discussion. Thanks for attending the presentation of the OeFSE Flagship Report. You can access it at the ÖFSE webpage and also order your print copy if you wish so. I would say this was only the start of a very interesting discussion. I sadly agree with Wolfgang Lapuh on what he has been saying, that COVID-19 will remain, especially in the global south, for another while. So as we have now had a discussion about the impact, I think we need to go along to come up with discussions and actions about what the responses need to be in the future. Thank you very much for participating. Thank you very much for your interesting inputs. I wish a nice evening to all of you. And of course, also a nice Christmas holiday, which is approaching rapidly. Thank you very much.